everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a book that's, well, it's a bit of a brain twister, but it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's called Science Sanity by Alfred Korzybski. Have you heard of it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic.
Yeah, and it gets into this idea that how we use language, like literally how we talk and think, it actually
Impacts a lot.
yeah, our mental well-being, how we make decisions, all of that.
Pretty powerful stuff.
It is. So in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack some of Korzybski's key ideas.
Okay.
Especially this whole concept of general semantics.
Right.
And how it can help us bridge this gap between science and sanity and maybe even make sense of this crazy world we live in.
Well, one thing that always strikes me is that this book was published way back in 1933.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
It is. And it's still relevant today. Think about it. It's been reprinted 5 times. The latest edition in 1994.
So people are still finding value in these ideas.
Absolutely. I mean, what did Korzybski see that we're still grappling with almost a century later?
Yeah.
That's what's so fascinating.
It's true. Makes you wonder, what was he on to?
Well, his main argument was that the way we use language, which is largely based on traditional Aristotelian logic,
Okay.
it kind of boxes us in and makes it harder to think clearly and accurately about the world.
So our own words are working against us.
In a way, yes. And that mismatch between how we talk and how reality actually works, it can lead to all sorts of problems, misunderstandings, conflict, even stress.
So that's where the whole sanity part of the title comes in.
Exactly. Korzybski really believed that if we could use language more effectively, more in tune with reality, it could actually lead to better mental health.
So, like, he saw this connection between the way we think and how we feel.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, it reminds me of that part in Gulliver's Travels where Gulliver visits this island, Laputa, and everyone there is obsessed with language.
Oh, yes.
They're so deep in thought that they need these servants with inflated bladders to, like, snap them out of it.
I love that analogy.
And Korzybski actually mentions that in the book.
He does.
He saw a parallel there. Even though it's satire, he thought Swift was on to something about the dangers of language getting, like, disconnected from reality.
Right. Like, we can get so caught up in words that we lose sight of what they actually refer to.
Okay, so we all know language can be messy, but how does this actually play out in everyday life?
Well, Korzybski gives this great example. It's about an argument over something really simple. A box of matches.
A box of matches, okay.
Yeah. 2 people were arguing, each convinced they were right, but it turns out they couldn't agree on what box meant.
Wait, seriously?
Yep. One person was thinking of the outer cardboard part, while the other meant the inner box that held the matches.
So they were both technically right, but the word itself was the problem.
Exactly. And I think we've all been there, right? Where a misunderstanding over a word can just spiral out of control.
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time. But how does this go beyond just, everyday arguments?
Well, for Korzybski, these mix-ups weren't just annoying. They were symptomatic of a bigger problem, this tendency to get stuck in what he called Aristotelian thinking.
Okay, and remind me, what does that mean again?
It's basically this black and white thinking, forcing things into categories when the world is way more complex than that.
Yeah, in the book's intro, there's this table that compares Aristotelian versus non-Aristotelian orientations.
Right.
And it's pretty intense. Like, one row says 2 valued certainty versus infinite valued as a natural law as universal non-gravitation. What did he even mean by that?
Well, he was basically saying, stop getting trapped in either thinking. Like saying a book is either good or bad, with no room for anything in between.
Right.
A non-Aristotelian approach would say, hold on, there are degrees of good and bad, and your opinion might even change depending on, who you are or what you're looking for in a book. The world just isn't that black and white.
So it's more like a spectrum than a checklist.
Exactly. And another point on that table contrasts static absolutism with dynamic relativism.
Yeah.
The old way of thinking wants absolute, unchanging truth.
Right.
But Korzybski is saying, hey, knowledge is always evolving. What's true in one situation might not be true in another. We need to be more flexible, willing to update our thinking.
That reminds me of how in science we have to be open to new evidence, even if it challenges what we thought we knew.
That's a great connection.
It's like Korzybski's pushing for that same open-mindedness in all areas of life.
Exactly. And he really emphasized the importance of structure, not just in science or math, but in how we use language.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow.
Think of a mathematical circle. It's defined by its structure. But then we can use that same concept to understand things like coins, wheels, even planet orbits.
Ah, I see. So it's abstract but powerful.
Yes. And language can be like that too. If we get the structure right, it becomes this mental tool that helps us make sense of all sorts of different experiences.
But if our language is like poorly structured, then our thinking gets all messed up.
Right. And that definitely impacts our sanity, like the book's title suggests.
Okay, this is where I'm getting a little lost. He also talked about humans as time binders, but how does that fit into all of this?
This is where it gets really interesting. Korzybski realized that unlike animals, we humans can learn from the past and use that knowledge to shape the future.
We're not just reacting to the present.
Exactly. We're building on what came before us, which makes language even more powerful, for better or for worse.
So it's like each generation inherits this giant library of knowledge through language, and we can add to it.
Exactly. But that also means we can inherit bad habits of thinking and speaking, even if we're not aware of it.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. So if language can be so limiting, how do we even begin to use it more effectively?
That's $1 million question, isn't
Yeah.
it? And the thing is, Korzybski, he didn't really give us a step-by-step guide.
Oh, okay.
It's more like he gave us this framework for thinking about language itself.
So it's more about like awareness than having a bunch of rules.
Right. And it starts with recognizing that language has limitations. Words are just symbols, right?
Yeah.
They're not the actual things they represent.
Like that famous quote, the map is not the territory.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy for what Korzybski was getting at.
Okay.
Our language is like a map of reality, and if the map is flawed, well, we're going to get lost.
Makes sense.
That's where this whole non-Aristotelian orientation comes in. He's basically saying, hey, let's update our mental maps
Oh, okay.
to better reflect the world as it is, all messy and complex and everything.
Less rigid categories, more open-mindedness. Got it. But in the preface to Science and Sanity,
Yeah.
Robert Pula, he talks about how time binding,
Right.
how can we use that to like communicate better, make smarter decisions, actually live better?
Well, knowing that we are time binders means acknowledging that our knowledge is constantly evolving.
So instead of like clinging to old ideas,
Yeah,
we need to be ready to, learn and update our thinking.
exactly. And that applies to everything from, how we talk to our loved ones to how we tackle big global issues like climate change.
He also mentions Pula does these neurosemantic and neurolinguistic factors being applied to like psychological problems.
Oh, interesting.
That sounds a little complicated.
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. Korzybski realized that how we use language has a huge impact on our mental and emotional well-being.
Okay.
So if we start paying attention to how our words and thoughts are, influencing how we feel,
Yeah.
we can actually break out of those negative patterns and start creating healthier ways of relating to ourselves and to the world.
So it's like therapy, but with a focus on language.
You could say that, yes.
And then he talks about consciousness of abstracting.
Yes.
And honestly, I have no idea what that means.
It's basically realizing that we can't take in everything all at once.
Right.
Right. So our brains, they kind of simplify information to make it more manageable.
Okay.
But we need to remember that those simplified models, they're not the whole picture.
So we're always looking at the world through a filter.
Right.
And that filter is shaped by our language and our experiences and all of that.
Exactly. And if we're not aware of that filter, it's really easy to make assumptions, jump to conclusions, and miss important details.
Right. And especially these days with so much information coming at us from all directions.
Exactly. That's where consciousness of abstracting becomes so important. It helps us become more critical thinkers.
Another thing Pula talked about is orders of abstracting.
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand that one either.
Think of it like this. Imagine you're looking at a tree.
Okay.
At the most basic level, you're seeing shapes, colors, textures.
Mm-hmm.
Then your brain abstracts that information. It recognizes it as a tree.
Right.
But then you can go further, right?
Yeah.
You might think about what kind of tree it is, its role in the ecosystem, even its symbolic meaning in literature.
Okay, so each level adds more complexity.
Exactly. Like rungs on a ladder.
Okay, got it.
And the problem is we often confuse those levels.
So,
Like if we treat a highly abstract concept like justice as if it's a concrete object, we're going to run into some trouble.
that makes sense. People argue about abstract concepts all the time without even, like, defining what they mean.
Exactly. And being aware of these different levels of abstraction can make our thinking more flexible and nuanced,
Yeah.
less likely to get stuck in those rigid ideologies.
This is all really helpful.
Yeah.
But I gotta be honest, it also sounds pretty challenging to actually live this way, you know? Like, I can't analyze every word I say.
And you shouldn't have to. It's not about being perfect. It's about cultivating awareness.
Okay.
You don't need to be a master of general semantics to benefit from these ideas.
So where's a good starting point?
Well, think about situations where communication is really important. Maybe a disagreement with a loved one, a negotiation at work, or even just trying to understand a complex news story.
Okay.
Just take a moment to consider. Are we using the same definitions? Are we confusing facts with opinions? Are we stuck in that black and white thinking? Even those small shifts in awareness can make a big difference.
That's a good reminder. But what about the bigger picture? Like, how can general semantics help us with, well, everything Korzybski talked about? Mental well-being, better decision-making, creating a saner world, all of that.
Well, that's where it gets really exciting. Because general semantics isn't just about using language more effectively. It's about using it to create a more just and humane world.
Okay.
Remember, Korzybski believed that our outdated ways of thinking, they actually contribute to a lot of the conflict and suffering in the world.
Right.
So by shifting to a more non-Aristotelian approach, we can potentially find new ways to bridge divides and create a more peaceful and sustainable world.
I like that. And in the intro to the book,
Yeah.
Korzybski talks about how we make generalizations all the time.
Right.
Based on, like, limited information.
We do. It's a natural human tendency.
He uses the example of a mathematical equation for a curve, which, like, represents all these points. But then he points out how in real life, we often generalize without enough data.
Yes.
Which leads to bad conclusions.
It's like he's reminding us to be humble, right? Our mental maps are just that, maps.
Not the territory itself.
Exactly. And especially today, when we're bombarded with information from every direction,
It's true.
it's more important than ever to be critical thinkers.
Totally. It's so easy to just get swept up in, the latest headline or social media trend without really thinking about the information.
And he gives this, well, it's actually kind of a chilling example of how vague language can be really dangerous. He uses the Japanese military's use of the word loot during World War II.
Okay.
And the term was never actually defined. So it ended up being used to justify, well, basically any kind of theft or violence.
That's scary. It's like the vagueness of the word itself gave them permission to do terrible things.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we need to hold people accountable for the language they use, especially those in positions of power.
Another example he uses is Adolf Hitler's rise to power.
Right.
And how he exploited the limitations of language to manipulate people. That's a disturbing but very important example. Korzybski shows how Hitler used really simplistic language, strong emotions, and scapegoating to create division and hatred. It's classic propaganda. Unfortunately, it's still being used today.
It's a stark reminder that, we need to be aware of these manipulative tactics.
We do.
And develop the critical thinking skills to resist them.
Absolutely. Education and critical thinking are our best defense against those kinds of things.
Okay, this has been, well, a lot to process.
Yeah.
But I'm also feeling a sense of hope.
Oh, good.
It's like if we can just become more aware of how language works, we can actually use it as a tool for good.
That's exactly what Korzybski believed. He saw general semantics as a way to actually transform human consciousness, to create a more sane and ethical society.
It's a big goal.
It is. But I think his ideas offer a powerful roadmap, especially for the challenges we face in the 21st century.
This has been a mind-blowing deep dive. I've learned so much about the power of language and, well, how it really shapes our reality.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I encourage everyone to explore Korzybski's work and see how these ideas can make a difference in your own life.
I'm definitely going to keep digging into this stuff. Now on to part 3. It makes you wonder, how would Korzybski view the world today?
Oh, that's a good question.
I mean, with all the political division, the constant news, the arguments online, it feels like communication is it's harder than ever.
Yeah, it can feel that way for sure.
Yeah.
I think he'd probably be both concerned and hopeful.
Really?
Concerned because so many of the problems he talked about back in the 1930s are still with us today.
Right.
But hopeful because he really believed in the power of general semantics to help us navigate all this complexity.
So where do we even begin? If we're all caught in these old ways of thinking and speaking, how do we break free and start actually communicating better?
Well, he always emphasized that consciousness of abstracting,
Right.
Remembering that our words, they're not the things themselves.
Right.
That we're always filtering information through our own, experiences and biases.
It's like that saying, don't believe everything you think.
Exactly. We have to be willing to question our own assumptions.
And be open to other perspectives.
Yes. Even those we disagree with, Korzybski was really against that either thinking.
Oh, okay.
Recognizing that most issues are way more nuanced than that.
Less judgment, more curiosity. I like that. But how does that work with something like politics, where it feels like everyone's just talking past each other?
I think he'd say we need to get better at defining our terms.
What do you mean?
So often, arguments happen because people are using the same words, but they mean totally different things by them.
Right.
So if we could just pause and say, wait, what do you mean by freedom? What do I mean by that? We might find we're not as far apart as we thought.
That's a really good point. It's like in science, you have to be so precise with your language. To avoid confusion, maybe we need to apply that same rigor to how we talk about, politics, social issues, even just everyday conversations.
I think that would be helpful.
And what about the emotional side of language?
Oh, that's huge. Korzybski talked about how easily we can be swayed by words that are emotionally charged, even if they're not actually based on facts,
Think about how many headlines are designed to, make you afraid or angry.
Exactly.
Instead of actually giving you information.
It's like clickbait for our brain.
Totally. And then we react without even thinking critically.
Right. And he also talked about the dangers of identification.
Okay.
Where we confuse, our words or labels with the actual person or thing.
So stereotypes and prejudice.
Exactly. We'll make these sweeping generalizations about entire groups of people.
Right, based on just one characteristic.
General Semantics encourages us to see individuals as unique, not just representatives of a group.
It's about recognizing the complexity of people.
Yes. And moving away from those simplistic labels and rigid categories, embracing a more nuanced, compassionate view of the world.
This is making me realize how these ideas can actually have a real impact, on how we interact with each other and the world around us.
That's what's so powerful about general semantics. It's not just some intellectual exercise.
Right.
It's a way of being in the world, a way of approaching life with more awareness, more flexibility, and definitely more compassion.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I've learned so much, not just about language.
Oh, good.
But about myself and how I can communicate better and just be a more thoughtful person.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, Korzybski believed that even small changes in how we use language can have a ripple effect.
Creating positive change.
Yes, in our relationships, our communities, and even the world as a whole.
It's pretty inspiring to think that we have the power to shape our reality through how we use language.
We do. And it's a journey, a process of learning and growth. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving for that sanity that Korzybski talked about.
Thank you so much for taking us on this journey. It's given me a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, remember, the map is not the territory. And you have the power to create better maps for yourself and for the world.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep those minds sharp.